is a film that was made to kind of commemorate the 50th anniversary of the fall of Tibet and the flight into exile of the Dalai Lama. And what we intended to do with the film was to kind of take a look at the Tibet situation today, the political situation, and to really take stock of it and to kind of think, where are we at with Tibet, where are we heading, and what should the future be. So that was the intention. The film itself was shot in 2008 when the big uprising took place in Tibet, and we followed the Dalai Lama for most of that year, and it follows a year in the political life of Tibet in exile and inside Tibet, and it really addresses this question of where is this Tibetan movement headed.
Give us an introduction of the people and some of the stories.
Okay.
Well, one of the elements that we followed, apart from the Dalai Lama, that year is the march to Tibet. On March 10th, 2 years ago, a group of Tibetans decided to get together and go from Dharamsala into Tibet. The idea was to go back to their country. They've been refugees long enough and they wanted to go back to their country. So a group of people got together and started walking. And it was very, very interesting because it's a very long walk to the border, and one of the main characters we follow is called Tenzing, who is a young radical Tibetan man who believes that independence is the way to go. So he's very much there in our film along with the other marchers, and it took them about 4 months, I think, marching, and we followed a lot of the march, and we were there at the end when they weren't able to make it inside Tibet and the Indian authorities stopped them because India has this long border with China and they feel constantly under threat, and so there was a lot of pressure for them to stop the marchers, and they did so about 60 kilometers from the border.
One of the reasons we made this film was because we felt that within the Tibetan community, especially in exile but also inside Tibet, there's a lot of debate and discussion going on right now about the Dalai Lama's Middleweight Approach, China's kind of constant rejection of it, the Dalai Lama's age now, I mean he is 75, and what the future course of the Tibet movement should be. And there are many different voices being heard in this debate. So we felt like it was really important to try and open this debate up, open this discussion so that people could kind of really think about it. So most of the voices in our film are actually Tibetan. I don't think we have any...
just one Chinese voice.
We have one Chinese voice, Wang Lishong, and some Chinese students that we interviewed in America, but primarily it's a Tibetan debate. And so we have the Dalai Lama on the one side who really explains his Middleweight Approach, why he believes that this is the best course of action for Tibet. And then we have other people like Jamyang Norbu, who is a Tibetan writer and intellectual based in America, one of the most vocal critics of the Dalai Lama's Middleweight Approach, a very staunch advocate of independence, and a number of other similar people, Students for a Free Tibet, Laden Tetong, who was the director. And so those are the primary voices in the film.
Tell us about how you went about filming in Tibet and what kinds of difficulty you encountered.
One of the key interviewees in our film is the Tibetan poet and writer Weser, who lives in Beijing, and she's been incredibly brave and courageous in constantly writing about what she perceives to be the problems in Tibet. And we filmed Weser in Beijing and her husband Wang Lishong, and surprisingly didn't have any problems doing that. Now, immediately after that, the troubles broke out in Tibet, so we realized that it would be very, very difficult for us to go into Tibet to film. Anyway, they had blocked Tibet to all outside people, including the international media. No one was allowed to go to Tibet for several months, I think up until the Olympics. So we decided that it was too risky for us to go into Tibet, and anyway, we didn't want to film people in Tibet, interview people in Tibet, because that's something that always gets people into trouble. What we wanted to do was to capture footage that kind of showed some of the problems that are occurring in Tibet. One of the big ones being migration, the demographic changes that are taking place in Tibet. The other being the cultural kind of changes that are also taking place, what Weser calls the cultural imperialism that's going on in Tibet. So these were images that we wanted to capture from inside Tibet, the train as well, which has changed everything in Tibet. So what we ended up doing was we sent a friend of ours who traveled as a tourist to Tibet. He was one of the first tourists to go to Tibet after they opened up Tibet to tourists in August, and he filmed for us using a small camera, like as a tourist. But more importantly than that, we managed to access several, a lot of footage from inside Tibet, shot by various different people that made it to the outside world. So we had, there's the case of Thundup Wangchen, who is this filmmaker who has been now sentenced to 6 years in prison for interviewing ordinary Tibetans. So we used his footage. We used footage shot by various news agencies during the uprising. We had access to radio interviews conducted with Tibetan students in Beijing, for instance, who spoke out about their feelings about what had happened. So we collected a whole range of voices from inside Tibet that we also incorporated into the film.
Can you briefly describe the middleweight?
Since the late 80s, the Dalai Lama has formulated this policy that he calls the Middleweight Approach. Middleweight Approach actually comes from a kind of a Buddhist concept, the middle way, which is avoiding extreme positions and finding a middle ground. So his middleweight approach was to give up the demand for Tibet's independence, not saying that he doesn't believe that Tibet was independent in the past, but he believes that there's nothing to be gained from looking at the past. It's more important to look to the future. So giving up the demand for independence, but in return he's asking for what he calls genuine autonomy for the 3 traditional provinces of Tibet. Now, the 3 traditional provinces of Tibet are what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region, almost all of Qinghai province, and parts of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Gansu.
How does the Chinese leadership react to the concept of genuine autonomy?
China has just constantly rejected it, called it a kind of a disguised demand for independence, and it continues to do so even today.
Has the film been shown yet?
Yeah, it had its US opening in Palm Springs, and that's when the Chinese people from the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles phoned up the Palm Springs Film Festival and asked them to remove our film because it was portraying Tibet, and really they felt that there shouldn't be a film about Tibet, a kind of pro-independence film being screened, and they had never even seen the film when they said that. So and then they drove over to Palm Springs and they asked the director to remove the film. And when the film festival said, you can't come and meddle in our affairs in our country, this is a film festival, we can show whatever we like. Then the Chinese consulate decided to remove 2 of the Chinese films that were going to show, and which we felt was very sad for the Chinese filmmakers. After all, they're the ones who are suffering in all of this. They had made good films and they had reason to show their films, but they had no choice. And so yes, it screened there. It was very, very well received, and the added publicity, of course, of the fact that the Chinese government had asked us to remove the film. People were so outraged, the audience was outraged, and they wanted to support Tibet, and they came there and they always said, what can we do, and we're going to stop buying Chinese goods, we can't let the Chinese do this to us. So that was a very strong response, and now it's going to show in New York for 2 weeks, starting March 31st at the Film Forum. So we hope, of course, that everyone shows up.